It's been some time since I do a video on this channel. I've been promising a video on Michel Foucault that would be a follow-up to the video series I started some time ago. And then I did a video on Heidegger, and then I did a video on Star Trek, and then I did a bunch of videos that were, for the most part, unrelated in many respects. Now, I want to return to the videos of Michel Foucault, pretty much from when I was last working on them, and follow up on some of the other themes I was going to explore on it. So this is the third part of this video series. I still have a couple more to go, and then I'm probably going to wrap it up right after. From where we were last, we were talking about Michel Foucault's actual work. We kind of worked our way there by talking about the context in which Foucault started writing and why Foucault's intervention was significant in the history of philosophy. Now, what Foucault started making us situation a little bit more concretely than perhaps the existentialist philosophers would. In that respect, we mostly compared Foucault to the work of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, and at times mentioned people like Maurice Merleau-Ponty or Frantz Fanon. One of the guiding questions last time was the question, can we think of any open spaces for action or resistance to power and knowledge that account for this structural circumstance or the situation that pretty much informs our experience or situates our experience as grounded, not as an impenetrable wall, but as something informative of where our actions take place? Can we have actions that are radical enough to refigure this structure that regulates how it is that we are subject to it? And that's the question I want to take off from. I'm moving from the early work from Foucault to the later work of Foucault, and this marks a significant difference of how he addresses a few questions. We can begin by noting a change in focus on the later volumes of the History of Sexuality, where Foucault focuses on practices of making a self rather than the structures of discourses that inform this self in the making. In the introduction to the use of pleasure, this shift in tone makes itself apparent by the immediate task of clarifying the first volume of which this is a sequel. Foucault notes that, and here I quote, "When I came to study the modes according to which individuals are given to recognize themselves as sexual subjects, the problems were much greater." End quote. Foucault notes how the notion of desire and the desiring subject maintain a generally accepted undercurrent to the discourses of sexuality. At best, Foucault said that he sought to analyze the practices by which individuals were led to focus their attention on themselves, to decipher, recognize, and acknowledge themselves as subjects of desire, bringing into play themselves and themselves as a certain relationship that allows them to discover, in desire, the truth of their being. The interpretation of desire, which according to Foucault, it only mingled with sexuality, as the notion of sexuality developed in the early 19th century, was in part an exercise to know oneself. For in order to know oneself as subject to sexuality came by way of also recognizing oneself as subject of desire. These considerations have turned us from sexuality to desire, but as desire as it pertains self-fashioning, the making of a self, and building an ethos. As he notes, the texts he is turning towards are practical and pertain to the shaping of one's own conduct. Aside from philosophical texts in ancient Greece and Rome that pertain to conduct over desire, Foucault addresses the problematization of desire as it becomes moralized in paganism and Christian antiquity. I will highlight that this return to the origin of philosophy notes a move that coincides with Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger. Heidegger's broader project tries to revive the spirit of his time from alienating modernity by retrieving what he calls the fundamental question of being, rather than merely getting caught up with everyone think that's merely a hand. For Heidegger, this is too regional and partial a view, not foundational enough. By that, Heidegger means that we have lost the original meaning of the word being in translation, and he attempts to recover it from pre-Socratic times and in conversation with Socratic figures as well as the contemporary situations around Heidegger's time. Nietzsche similarly turned to Greek classical origin in order to revive the current times in the face of alienation. So in short, and to put it quite bluntly, we're dealing with a bunch of nostalgic-ass nerds. It is worth noting that in the use of pleasure, there's a name that keeps popping up here and there in Foucault's later work. Pierre Hadot was a historian of philosophy who was particularly devoted to ancient philosophy. His text What is Ancient Philosophy and Exercices Spirituels et Philosophie Antique came to resonate in Foucault's ethics of self-fashioning by interpreting and by reappropriating a notion from ancient philosophical practices as ascesis. What is most notable to mention about Hadot is that he makes a distinction between philosophy as an art of living as opposed to an art of reason. Where antiquity was concerned with the former, as modernity came along, the latter took hold. Foucault entertains the notion that the moral conceptions of Greece and Greco-Roman antiquity, and here I'm quoting, were much more oriented towards practices of the self and the question of ascesis than towards codifications of conduct and the strict definition of what is permitted and what is forbidden. The latter attitude might have well reached its apex through Immanuel Kant and his ethics, where duty and injunctions of obligation and obedience imported themselves onto a modern categorical imperative, as the codification of ethics altogether. It is, however, by highlighting this aspect of the question of ascesis that Foucault distinguishes the moralizations of desire by Christian antiquity in the later Roman world. To this extent, the question that starts concerning Foucault is succinctly stressed. Here I'm quoting, "This analysis of desiring man is situated at the point where an archaeology of problematizations and a genealogy of practices of the self intersect to explain how I was led through certain paradoxes and difficulties to substitute a history of ethical problematizations based on practices of the self for a history of systems of morality based hypothetically on interdictions." So that what was now at the core of problematizations of sexual conduct was no longer pleasure and the aesthetics of its use, but desire and its purifying hermeneutics. While the 60s Foucault called for the death of man, his later work, as in the aesthetics of experience or the return to morality, give examples of his return to the subject. Here I quote, "The point was to reintroduce the problem of the subject, which I had more or less left aside in my first studies. One of the things he notes, following this thread of thought from the use of pleasure, is that before Christianity, the practices of the self and conduct over desire were liberating exercise." And here I quote, "To affirm one's liberty and to give one's own life a certain form in which one could recognize oneself, be recognized by others, and which even posterity might take as an example." To give an example, Foucault uses the ancient Greek word penresia to distinguish his thought from modern liberal free speech. For Foucault, penresia already supposes a certain cultivation of the self, such that free speech doesn't just mean saying anything, but what one has cultivated to be powerful and truthful speech, which is discriminated only by its contemplative judgment. Whereas in Christianity and the structures of interdiction, we find that conduct becomes a matter of obedience to systems or rules rather than self-fashioning. In this case, we find that powerful, truthful speech is set aside to sustain obedience to rules through some pastoral centralization of power from Christian antiquity to the Middle Ages to modernity. In this respect, political reason has been given a genealogy that is effectively in both the state and the individual, but of which liberation can only come by looking at the roots of its history. This is the depth to which Foucault's return to Greco-Roman antiquity played a significant role on reframing his project, as at the roots of political reason and modernity, this historical difference offered something that could be imported into current times as potentially radical. Not only does Foucault return to antiquity, but he also reconsiders his relationship to the Enlightenment project and modernity while reading Kant's What is Enlightenment? In an interview by Foucault titled The Art of Telling the Truth. Foucault stresses Kant's word for enlightenment, Aufklärung, as a consideration of the present and being a contemporary. Foucault stresses that the question Kant invites us to consider is not that of what is it in the present situation that can determine this or that decision of philosophical order, but rather, what is it in the present that produces meaning now for philosophical reflection? The question of historical belonging of the question and the questioner, according to Foucault, become a central thematic to how philosophy poses question over itself after Kant. And as part of the critical theoretical turn in philosophy, Foucault himself has inherited from Kant this kind of question which situates philosophy itself. The Aufklärung call itself Aufklärung, here I'm quoting Foucault. It is certainly a very singular process that became aware of itself by naming itself, by situating itself in relationship to its past and future, and by designating the operations that it must carry out within its own present. End quote. The question of the Enlightenment through this reading of Kant's Aufklärung pertains how can one assume being a contemporary of the present, and in turn, how can one define such a present? So far, we can at least say that the art of telling the truth comes by assuming one's situation that locates the truth. Foucault draws a distinction between two responses to Kant, the analytic philosophy of truth in general, or a critical thought where the present is accounting for itself under questions such as what is our present, and what is the present field of possible experiences. These types of questions, which Foucault associates with Hegel, Nietzsche, and so on, are the position with which Foucault seeks to associate and how he approaches truth. What is particularly curious about this is that we have returned to a position similar to that of the existentialists as they set it up when we were a few videos back. Particularly Sartre, who took Kant's notion of ethical responsibility and universality, insofar as the singular present human existence and its actions may determine the very meaning of humanity as a whole, or at least this is a way that coincides in both Kant, Sartre, and now Foucault. We have gone from a critique of radical freedom to a series of structures of power to returning to self-fashioning as Foucault scrambled for sites for action and liberation. Briefly, and moving on to more critical sections, I wish to introduce Hélène Badiou's criticisms of Foucault, which at the moment are twofold. Did Foucault offer something radically different, or did he simply return to the same old shit? And the other question would be, did Foucault actually offer us an adequate theory of the subject? Now, Hélène Badiou would argue that Foucault returned to the same, and his attempt at theorizing the subject was too constricted by structure still. For Badiou, Foucault set himself up by saying that disciplinary structures of power not only have internalizations on the subject, but produce the subject itself as well as producing resistances. According to Badiou, while Foucault was able to account for the production of the subject, he was not quite able to isolate the sources of resistances that were independent from power. And when Foucault turned towards self-fashioning aesthetics and a lifestyle politic, Badiou's question is simply, and here I quote Badiou, again, the source of such privileged agency, why do some subjects shape themselves against the grain and not others, is not explained. In the sequel to one of Badiou's most notable works, Being an Event, which is followed by Logics of Worlds, we may note that the central difference between Badiou and Foucault pertains truth. Whereas Foucault is concerned with what is presented, Badiou is concerned with a theory of being as being, presentations aside. In contrast to Foucault, Badiou addresses truth as immanent of an event that refigures its subject, as the subject emerges by taking on an attitude towards what he calls a truth procedure that follow from the introduction of something new into being, whether this is by remaining faithful to the event that has been emerging out of nothing, by resurrecting the truth to the event. The resistance which Foucault can't quite account for himself seems to be relatively easy for Badiou to account for. Resistance is for a truth that the subject remains faithful to, besides all ambiguous fictions one may assume to talk around it. So this is the end of this section, ending up at this brief discussion about how Badiou has a problem with Foucault, and this is leading up to other forms of critique that I want to address Foucault. I will be quite honest, I had my time being a fan with Foucault, and I think I mentioned this a few videos ago, but I'm no longer in that same place, so I'm mostly using Foucault at this point as a prop to other thinkers that I think are doing work that Foucault cannot account for, in my opinion. But also taking this as a chance to try to flesh out what Foucault thought himself as well as I can, so I hope you folks are enjoying this. As I mentioned, I haven't been doing videos for some time, so I want to try to do that a little bit more so. One thing that would be helpful would be comments in the comment section that would tell me a little bit about what you folks want to see me talk about. I know I haven't been fully explicit about some of the things that I can offer. I'm currently very interested in a lot of psychoanalysis, which has been a lot of my videos. I know quite a bit of Marx, Hegel, so I could do a few videos on that. I've taken a lot of interest in Hélène Badiou's philosophy, which came up this time around, and another philosopher called Byung-Chul Han, who will be coming up next time around. Yeah, I think at some point I might try to do a brief Q&A video, so if you have any questions or anything, I would love to take them on, just to play around with something slightly different from the format I'm used to. So with that said, like, comment, and subscribe. Cheers.